Frank Maddox didn't look like much when he pulled into the Riverside shooting range every Saturday morning. His rust-colored pickup truck wheezed to a stop in the far corner of the gravel lot, away from the gleaming SUVs and lifted trucks that belonged to the weekend warriors. The tailgate was held shut with rope and duct tape, and dust coated every surface like a second skin. At 68, Frank moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing rarely improved anything. He wasn't frail. His shoulders still carried strength beneath his faded olive jacket, but every motion seemed calculated, purposeful. He'd nod politely to the range officer, sign his name in careful cursive, and walk directly to Lane 7, always. Lane 7. The other regulars had their theories about Frank. Tommy Martinez, who worked construction and spent Saturdays trying to impress his teenage son, swore Frank had been Special Forces. "Look at how he holds that rifle," Tommy would whisper. "That's not hunting technique." Others figured he was just another Vietnam vet with too much time and not enough to say about it. Frank's rifle case told its own story, worn leather with brass fittings that had seen decades of use. No tactical stickers, no brand logos, just honest wear from countless range sessions. He'd set up methodically, unfold his shooting mat, adjust his spotting scope, and load 5 rounds with the same ritual precision others reserved for church. What struck people most was the silence. Frank didn't swap war stories or debate ammunition brands. He came for the echo of gunshots rolling across the hills, for the moment when breath, trigger, and target aligned into perfect stillness. The kind of focus that made everything else disappear. But today something was different. The morning air carried tension that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds. A black government SUV with pristine plates sat parked near the entrance, and through the range's chain-link fence, Frank could see a figure in tactical gear setting up with unnecessary flourish. Frank had seen enough recruiters in his lifetime to recognize one from 100 yards. This one looked young, confident, and loud, the kind who treated every conversation like a recruitment pitch. As Frank loaded his first magazine, he caught fragments of the stranger's voice carrying across the range. "Proper stance, gentlemen." And "That's how Marines do it." The old man just shook his head slightly and focused on his breathing. He'd been coming here for peace, not performance. But something told him that today his quiet Saturday routine was about to be interrupted. He lined up his shot, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against his shoulder. The target downrange seemed impossibly small to most shooters, but Frank's world had narrowed to that single point of focus. His finger found the trigger, and for one perfect moment, everything else faded away. The shot cracked across the range, sharp and clean. The show-off arrives. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cruz stepped out of his SUV like he was walking onto a movie set. At 29, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never met a challenge he couldn't talk his way through. His tactical vest looked fresh from the catalogue, complete with patches that spelled out his accomplishments for anyone within reading distance. "Morning, folks!" Cruz called out, his voice cutting through the range's natural quiet like a bullhorn. "Beautiful day to make some freedom ring." A few younger shooters chuckled and nodded. Cruz was here on assignment, community outreach, his commanding officer had called it. Show the flag, hand out some brochures, maybe find a few promising recruits among the local talent. Easy duty, and Cruz figured he might as well have some fun with it. He unloaded his gear with theatrical precision, custom rifle case, extra magazines, multicam gloves, and a GoPro mounted on his shoulder to capture what he assumed would be impressive footage. Everything screamed professional, expensive, military grade. "Let's show these civilians how it's done," he muttered to himself, loud enough for the nearest shooters to hear. That's when his eyes landed on Frank down at Lane 7, quietly going through. his routine like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The old man's rifle looked like something from a museum, bolt action, iron sights, no modern accessories. Cruz nudged Tommy Martinez, who was struggling to sight in his hunting rifle. Old-timer. "Bringing that relic out here for nostalgia?" Cruz asked with a smirk. Tommy shrugged uncomfortably. "That's Frank. Comes every week, always quiet. Shoots clean, though." Cruz's grin widened. "Well, let's see if he can still handle recoil without rattling loose." He said it loud enough to carry, and several heads turned. Frank didn't look up from loading his rifle, but Tommy noticed the old man's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Cruz claimed lane 5, 2 spots down from Frank, and made sure everyone knew it. He called out wind conditions like he was briefing a mission, snapped his bolt with exaggerated flair, and narrated his shot placements for anyone within earshot. "Dead center, textbook form," he announced after his first shot. "That's how we do it, gentlemen." He paused to glance at Frank, who remained perfectly still and composed. The contrast was striking. Cruz with his high-tech equipment and running commentary, Frank with his simple rifle and monk-like concentration. "Looks like Grandpa's prepping for a museum exhibit," Cruz muttered to a young shooter loading magazines nearby. The comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles, but Tommy Martinez didn't laugh. He'd seen Frank shoot before, and something about the old man's stillness reminded him of a coiled spring. Frank's lane light turned green. He exhaled slowly, then squeezed the trigger with deliberate care. The crack echoed off the hills. Clean.
Sharp. Final. Cruz glanced sideways, unimpressed, until Frank's target slid back down the range.
One perfect hole, dead center. Frank didn't react, didn't celebrate. He simply chambered the next round with the same mechanical precision. By the third shot, the guy next to Cruz whispered, "You might want to stop talking," but Cruz was already frowning, watching Frank's target accumulate a group so tight it looked like someone had used a hole punch. 5 shots, 5 perfect hits, no wasted motion or second guessing. The range had gone quiet. The revelation Cruz took off his sunglasses and walked over slowly, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. The target Frank had just sent downrange defied everything Cruz thought he knew about recreational shooting. Those weren't lucky shots. They were the work of someone who'd spent years, maybe decades, perfecting his craft. "You shoot like that."
"On purpose?" Cruz asked, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Frank looked up from cleaning his rifle, his weathered face showing no trace of pride or arrogance.
"Only when I'm trying." There was no boast in his voice, no need to impress. Just simple fact, delivered with the same quiet confidence that marked everything else about him. Cruz's eyes drifted down to Frank's rifle case, taking in details he'd missed before. The leather wasn't just worn, it was broken in by decades of careful use. The brass fittings were tarnished, but functional, and stitched into the side of the case, almost hidden by age and wear, was a small patch that made Cruz's blood run cold. U.S. Army Sniper School. The patch wasn't flashy or new. It was faded canvas with threadbare edges, the kind that didn't come from surplus stores. It was earned. Cruz had seen enough military insignia to recognize the real thing, and this was as authentic as they came. He cleared his throat, his voice dropping to a more respectful register.
You go through Fort Benning?" Frank didn't look up from reassembling his bolt. "A long time ago." Cruz took a step closer, suddenly aware of how much noise he'd been making earlier. "Sniper school's no joke." "When did you serve?" Frank paused.
For a moment, then replied evenly, 68 to 91. The numbers hit Cruz like a physical blow. Vietnam, 3 tours most likely, maybe more. The old man sitting quietly at lane 7 wasn't just another weekend shooter. He was a piece of living military history. Cruz glanced back at his own shooting station with its expensive scope and digital rangefinder, then at Frank's iron sights and steady hands. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. The silence, the precision, the complete lack of need to prove anything to anyone. "Why not say something?" Cruz asked quietly. Frank gave a faint smile, the first real expression Cruz had seen from him. "Didn't think I needed to." The old man zipped up his rifle case with the same methodical care he'd shown all morning. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with unspoken understanding. Cruz finally asked, "What unit were you with?" Frank stopped in the gravel and looked over his shoulder. 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to MAC-VSOG for a while, before most folks knew what that meant. Cruz's face went completely white. MAC-VSOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. The most classified, most dangerous special operations unit of the Vietnam War. Men who'd jumped behind enemy lines with odds. That should have killed them all. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something Cruz had rarely felt in his young career, genuine respect for someone who'd earned it through fire and blood. He took a step back and gave a sharp nod. Not quite a salute, not here, not now, but close enough. Frank just tipped the brim of his faded army cap and walked back to his truck with the same steady pace he'd maintained all morning. Word spreads. The following Saturday, Frank noticed the change before he even reached the sign-in desk. Conversations died down as he walked past, replaced by respectful nods and curious glances. Word had spread through the tight-knit community of weekend shooters the way news always did, in small towns. Tommy Martinez approached him at lane 7 looking slightly embarrassed. "Frank, I owe you an apology. Should have said something last week when that recruiter was running his mouth." Frank shrugged as he unrolled his shooting mat. "No harm done, Tommy. Man was just doing his job." But something had shifted. The casual dismissal he'd grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by a recognition that made him slightly uncomfortable. Frank had spent decades blending into the background, and sudden attention felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Cruz was already there when Frank arrived, standing quietly near the equipment shed. No loud introductions this time, no chest-out speeches about ballistics or groupings. When Frank entered, Cruz nodded, small, respectful, and stepped aside without a word. The staff sergeant had brought a group of local recruits, young men from town who were considering military service. They clustered around the covered benches, nervous energy radiating from them like heat. Some were clearly trying too hard to look military, others seemed overwhelmed by the whole experience. Frank took his usual position and began his routine, but he could feel eyes on him. Not the dismissive glances from before, but the careful attention of people trying to learn something important. After his first string of shots, another perfect group that drew quiet murmurs of appreciation, Cruz approached the recruits with a different demeanor entirely. "You'll hear a lot of rules about shooting," he said, his voice steady and respectful. "A lot of technique and theory. But the best marksman I've ever seen told me something last week." He paused, glancing toward Frank. "It's not about hitting the target. It's about why you're aiming in the first place." The recruits nodded slowly, actually listening instead of just waiting for their turn to shoot. Frank caught the exchange and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of seeing wisdom passed down correctly. One of the younger men, a kid named Jake, who couldn't have been more than 18, approached Frank's lane hesitantly. "Sir?" he said quietly. "Could you maybe show me how you hold your rifle?"
"I keep pulling to the left." Frank looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw himself 45 years ago, eager, nervous, desperate to prove he belonged. "Sure," Frank said gently, setting down his own rifle. "Let's take a look." He adjusted Jake's stance, moving his shoulders slightly, correcting the grip that was causing the leftward pull. Simple adjustments, but they came from decades of hard-earned knowledge. "Your sight picture's off by just a hair," Frank explained, his voice patient. "That's enough to throw you off at distance. Try it now." Jake's next shot hit closer to center than any he'd managed all day. His face lit up with genuine accomplishment, the kind that came from learning rather than luck. By the time Frank packed up to leave, 3 more recruits had asked for advice. He'd given it freely, without ceremony or condescension, just one soldier helping the next generation find their way. As he passed Cruz's lane, the staff sergeant stood and nodded again, this time with the respect of one professional, acknowledging another. "Thank you," Cruz said sincerely. Frank paused. "Just doing what someone once did for me." The words carried weight that went beyond shooting tips and stance corrections. They spoke to a tradition of service that stretched back generations, passed along quietly from teacher to student, without fanfare or recognition. An unexpected invitation. 3 weeks later, Frank found an envelope in his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from Cruz, the penmanship careful and deliberate. "Some of the recruits are graduating next week. We'd be honored if you'd stop by. Just a small ceremony, nothing fancy, but we owe you more than you know." Frank almost tossed it aside. He'd never been one for public attention, and the thought of being put on display made him uncomfortable. But something in the handwriting, firm and respectful, made him pause. The ceremony was scheduled for the following Saturday at the range. Frank spent the week debating whether to attend, part of him wanting to maintain the quiet anonymity he'd cultivated for so many years. But Friday night, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set over the hills, he thought about Jake and the other young recruits. About the careful way Cruz had started treating the responsibilities of leadership. About the tradition of service that had shaped his own life and might still have something to offer the next generation. Saturday arrived grey and cold, with frost crunching under his boots as Frank walked to his truck. He'd dressed the same as always, jeans, flannel shirt, and his weathered army cap. No dress uniform, no medals, nothing that screamed veteran to anyone who didn't already know. The ceremony was held behind the main range building, where a small pavilion offered protection from the wind. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a modest podium, and a few flags snapping in the breeze. Families had gathered, parents, siblings, girlfriends, all dressed in their Saturday best to watch their boys take another step toward military service. Frank took a seat in the back, hoping to blend into the crowd, but Cruz spotted him immediately and nodded with unmistakable gratitude. The ceremony itself was simple, but dignified. Cruz called each recruit forward, handed out certificates of completion, and offered a firm handshake along with a few personal words. Frank recognized Jake among them, standing straighter now, more confident in his bearing. But before dismissing the group, Cruz turned to face the small crowd. "There's one more person we'd like to thank," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Someone who didn't ask to be noticed, didn't ask to be recognized, and didn't ask for anything in return." Frank felt his stomach tighten as every head turned in his direction. "This man reminded us that legacy isn't about medals or titles," Cruz continued. "It's about humility, skill passed on with respect,
and service that doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Cruz stepped forward and extended a simple wooden plaque. Frank rose reluctantly, aware of every eye in the pavilion tracking his movement. "With gratitude for your example, your quiet leadership, and your legacy," Cruz read from the plaque. The recruits stood as one, not because they'd been ordered to, but because something in them recognized they were witnessing something important. The applause was respectful rather than enthusiastic, acknowledging a debt that couldn't be fully repaid. Frank accepted the plaque with a simple nod, his throat too tight for words. In that moment, surrounded by young faces full of hope and determination, he felt the weight of every lesson he'd learned and every responsibility he'd carried finally being passed to worthy hands. The quiet teacher over the following months, Frank's Saturday routine evolved in ways he hadn't expected. He still arrived early, still claimed Lane 7, still maintained his methodical approach to marksmanship. But now, more often than not, he found himself surrounded by eager students. Jake had become a regular, bringing friends who were considering military service. Tommy Martinez started showing up with his teenage son, hoping to learn the kind of fundamentals that couldn't be found in magazines. Even some of the older shooters, men who'd been coming to the range for years, began asking Frank for advice on improving their accuracy. Frank found himself becoming something he'd never intended to be, a teacher. Not in any formal sense. He had no credentials beyond experience, no curriculum beyond what had kept him alive in places most people couldn't imagine. But his quiet competence drew people who were serious about learning. The rifle doesn't care about your politics or your paycheck, he'd tell new shooters. It only responds to fundamentals, breathing, trigger control, follow-through, master those, and everything else is just noise. Cruz had become a regular presence too, bringing different groups of recruits on rotation. The staff sergeant had transformed from the loud, flashy performer Frank had first encountered into someone who understood that real teaching happened in whispers, not shouts. One Saturday, in late fall, a new face appeared at the range. Sarah Chen, a young journalist from the county newspaper, approached Frank with notebook in hand and questions about the legendary marksman people kept mentioning around town. Frank politely declined the interview, as he had every request for publicity over the years. His story wasn't meant for newspapers or hero worship articles. It belonged to the men who'd shared foxholes with him, most of whom were either dead or dealing with their own demons in private. But Sarah lingered, watching. Frank worked with Jake and the other young shooters. She saw something that went beyond marksmanship instruction, a kind of mentorship that touched on character, discipline, and the weight of responsibility that came with skills that could take lives. "I'm not interested in war stories," she told Frank during a break. "But what you're doing here with these kids, that's worth writing about." Frank considered her words as he cleaned his rifle. Teaching had never been his intention, but it had become his reality. These young men were learning more than shooting techniques. They were absorbing lessons about integrity, humility, and the difference between competence and arrogance. "Write about them," Frank finally said, nodding toward the recruits. "They're the ones doing the real work now." Sarah smiled and put away her notebook. Sometimes the best stories were the ones that didn't need to be told, only lived. As winter approached and the Saturday crowds thinned, Frank found himself looking forward to the range more than ever. Not for the solitude he'd once cherished, but for the chance to see young faces light up with understanding, to watch confidence grow through competence rather than bluster. The plaque Cruz had given him sat on Frank's mantle at home, but the real reward was watching Jake hit his first perfect group, or seeing one of the recruits master the breathing technique that had taken Frank months to learn in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Legacy, he was learning, wasn't something you left behind. It was something you passed forward, one careful lesson at a time. Full circle, the spring brought unexpected visitors to the range. Frank was setting up at Lane 7 when he noticed a small convoy of vehicles pulling into the parking lot. Official. Plates, dress uniforms visible through tinted windows. His first instinct was to pack up and leave, but Cruz appeared at his elbow with an expression that mixed excitement and nervousness. "Sir, there's someone I'd like you to meet," Cruz said quietly. The someone turned out to be Colonel Patricia Hayes, Cruz's commanding officer, along with a small entourage that included a photographer and what looked like a Pentagon liaison. Frank's stomach dropped. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd spent decades avoiding. "Sergeant Cruz has told me quite a lot about you," Colonel Hayes said, extending her hand. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by." Frank shook her hand warily. "Ma'am, I understand you've been working with some of our recruits," she continued. "Unofficial mentoring, from what I hear, the kind of thing that can't be taught in any manual." Before Frank could deflect or minimize his role, Jake appeared at his side, now in uniform, having enlisted the previous month. Behind him came 3 other young men Frank recognized from the range, all wearing the confident bearing of people who'd found their calling. "Sir," Jake said, addressing Frank with formal respect, "we wanted to thank you properly." What followed was the kind of recognition Frank had always avoided but couldn't escape. The colonel spoke about the value of unofficial mentors, about how the best lessons often came from quiet teachers who asked for nothing in return. The photographer captured images of Frank with his former students, now active duty Marines. But what touched Frank most was a letter the recruits had written together, not for publication or official records, but as a personal thank you. It spoke about confidence earned through competence, about learning that true strength didn't need to announce itself, about understanding that service was about something bigger than individual glory. "You taught us how to shoot," Jake had written in careful block letters. "But more than that, you taught us how to be men worth following." After the official party left, Frank found himself alone at the range with Cruz and a handful of the regulars who'd witnessed the ceremony. The staff sergeant looked embarrassed by the attention, clearly understanding that Frank would have preferred to avoid it entirely. "I'm sorry about the circus," Cruz said, "but they needed to see what real leadership looks like." Frank nodded, understanding. The Cruz was still learning too, still figuring out how to balance military requirements with the kind of quiet mentorship that actually shaped lives. "You did fine," Frank said simply. "Just remember, it's not about the recognition, it's about the responsibility." As the sun set over the range, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber, Frank felt a sense of completion he hadn't expected. The angry young sniper who'd returned from Vietnam all those years ago had somehow become a teacher, a mentor, a link in a chain of service that stretched back generations and would continue long after he was gone. The transformation hadn't happened overnight or through any conscious decision. It had evolved naturally the way all meaningful change did, quietly, gradually, through small acts of service that accumulated into something larger than their individual parts. The legacy lives on. 5 years later, Frank still showed up at the range every Saturday morning, though his routine had evolved in ways his younger self could never have imagined. Lane 7 remained his preferred spot, but now it often served as an informal classroom where serious shooters gathered to learn from someone who'd forgotten more about marksmanship than most people would ever know. Jake had returned from his first deployment, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been tested and hadn't been found wanting. He brought new recruits when he was home on leave, continuing the cycle of mentorship that Frank had inadvertently started. "He saved my life," Jake told a group of wide-eyed teenagers one Saturday morning, nodding toward Frank. "Not in combat. He did that by teaching me how to be calm under pressure, how to make every shot count, how to be someone my unit could depend on." Frank deflected the praise, as he always did, but the words carried weight that went beyond shooting techniques. The lessons he'd learned in the jungles of Vietnam about discipline, preparation, and the deadly importance of getting things right. The first time had found new purpose in peacetime teaching. Cruz had been promoted and transferred, but he'd established a tradition before leaving. Every group of recruits spent at least one Saturday at the civilian range, learning from Frank and the other volunteer mentors who'd quietly joined the program. It wasn't official military training, but it filled gaps that no manual could address. The range itself had changed too. The owner, recognizing the value of what was happening, had set aside certain lanes for the mentorship program. A small plaque near the entrance acknowledged the quiet teachers who'd made the range a place where skills and character were developed together. Frank's hair was whiter now, and he moved more slowly than he had 5 years earlier. But his hands remained steady, his eyes sharp, and his ability to see potential in nervous young shooters hadn't dimmed. He'd become something he'd never set out to be, a living bridge between generations of service members, passing along lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. On quiet mornings when the range was empty except for him and his thoughts, Frank sometimes reflected on the journey that had brought him to this unexpected role. The angry young man who'd returned from Vietnam had needed decades to understand that his war wasn't over, it had just taken a different form. His battles now were fought with patience instead of violence, with encouragement instead of intimidation. Each young shooter who learned to breathe properly, to squeeze rather than jerk the trigger, to respect the weight of responsibility that came with precision, each one represented a small victory in a war against ignorance, arrogance, and the kind of carelessness that got people killed. The plaque from Cruz still sat on Frank's mantle, but the real monument to his legacy was walking around in uniform, serving their country with the quiet competence he'd tried to instill. They carried his lessons to new bases, new conflicts, new challenges he could only imagine. As Frank packed up his rifle case one Saturday evening, watching the sun paint the hills in familiar shades of gold, he thought about the strange path his life had taken. From sniper to teacher, from someone who dealt death with precision to someone who helped others find life through discipline and purpose. The transition hadn't been planned or dramatic. It had happened one quiet lesson at a time, one Saturday, morning after another, through the simple act of showing up and caring enough to do things right. His truck started on the third try, as it always did, and Frank drove home through the gathering dusk. Behind him, the range settled into evening quiet, waiting for another Saturday morning when quiet teachers would gather to pass along lessons that mattered more than medals or recognition. Some legacies were carved in stone. Others were written in the steady hands and clear eyes of young people who'd learned what it meant to be worthy of the trust placed in them. Frank Maddox had built the kind of monument that didn't need a nameplate to be remembered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.